There is a kind of hatred that does not begin with hurt, but with the collapse of an illusion. A narcissist does not truly hate you when you hurt them. They hate you when you leave in a way they cannot control. Because throughout the entire time you stayed, you were never a choice. In their eyes, you were a given, a fixed part of the emotional system they believed they had full control over. They did not love you the way you thought. They became accustomed to your reactions, to your returns, to the certainty that no matter what happened, you would still be there, allowing them to remain at the center. But the moment you leave, without explanation, without argument, without leaving behind any emotional reaction for them to hold on to, you are not just leaving a relationship, you are dismantling the entire structure they used to sustain their self-image. Because what they needed was never truly you, but the feeling of controlling you. And when that feeling disappears, they are not facing loss. They are facing a far more dangerous truth, that they never had the power they believed they did. And it is precisely this truth, quiet yet ruthless, that brings them back with the coldest and most persistent form of hatred, not directed at who you are, but at the fact that you have become living proof of their limits. Understand this clearly, not through emotion, but through awareness. A narcissist does not fear that you leave. They fear the moment you leave without carrying any need for them anymore. Because throughout the relationship, you never existed as an independent person. In their eyes, you existed as an extension of the emotional system they controlled, where every reaction of yours, from pain, anger, to hope, became proof that they were still the center of your inner world. And that is what fed their fragile yet insatiable ego. So as long as you kept explaining, kept trying to make things clear, kept returning after every fracture, you were unintentionally reinforcing their deepest belief that no matter what they did, you would still be there, still reacting, still revolving around them like an unbreakable law. They did not call that love, they called it certainty, a form of invisible power they never felt the need to protect because they believed it was permanent. But everything begins to change, not when you become angry, not when you confront them, but when you fall silent in a completely different way, a silence that no longer carries the expectation of being understood, no longer carries the need for validation, no longer comes from endurance, but from conscious withdrawal. And that moment creates a void they cannot fill with any familiar strategy. Because a narcissist can manipulate words, distort emotions, and navigate conflict, but they are completely powerless in the face of someone who no longer participates in the game. At first, they will not recognize this. Their mind will automatically interpret your absence as just another variation of the old cycle. They will assume you are creating distance, waiting for a reaction, testing the limits of the relationship, because in their model of the world, no one truly leaves. People only withdraw temporarily and then return. And that belief is not confidence. It is a defense mechanism built over years of successful manipulation, where every time you came back after being hurt, became data, reinforcing the illusion that they were an irreplaceable center. But this time, as days pass without explanation, as weeks pass without confrontation, as you no longer provide any emotional reaction for them to exploit, a disturbance begins to form within their psychological system. Because to them, your emotions were never expressions of connection, they were units of power. If they made you sad, they existed. If they made you angry, they had influence. If they made you explain, they controlled the narrative. But when you no longer react, that entire frame of reference collapses, and what unsettles them is not losing you, it is losing the ability to define their position in your mind. From there, they begin to test not with emotion, but with strategy, a neutral message, a vague gesture of concern, an unclear reminder none of it is meant to reconnect, but to check whether you are still bound. Because if you respond even slightly, they will interpret it as a signal that the psychological cord still exists, that they can still pull you back into the old orbit. But if you remain silent, if you hold on to that state of non-reaction that you earned through awareness and pain, then what follows is not sadness, but instability. Because for the first time, they are forced to face a reality that cannot be manipulated. You have become a psychologically independent entity, no longer revolving around them, no longer reflecting them, no longer providing the data they need to sustain their self-image. And when the ego cannot accept this collapse, it will not choose self-reflection. It will choose to rewrite the narrative. That is when you become the problem, not because you changed, but because they need an explanation that protects them from the truth. The truth that you did not leave out of weakness, not out of impulsiveness, but because you understood. And that understanding is the greatest threat of all. Because once someone has seen their pattern, how they create conflict, how they reverse responsibility, how they maintain power through emotion, that person cannot return to the same position without losing themselves. And that is why you become someone they can never fully erase, not because you were perfect, but because you are proof that their system has cracks, that their power has limits, that some people can step out of an orbit they once believed inescapable. And your very existence in silence, in calm, no longer being pulled back, becomes a constant reminder of what they cannot control. That you once lived inside their world, understood how it worked, and still chose to leave not to punish them, but to reclaim your own control. And that is what a narcissist cannot accept, not because they lost you, but because they lost the illusion that they never had limits. Look one layer deeper to understand what is truly happening inside them. Because when you leave, the first thing that appears is not emotion, but an automatic mechanism that has been programmed long ago, a nearly unconscious psychological reflex. Instead of accepting the reality that you have left, they interpret it in the way most familiar to them: this is just a phase. In the inner world of a narcissist, the concept of permanent loss of control does not exist. Everything is cyclical, every distance is temporary. Every departure is simply a step in a loop that will eventually return to its starting point. And this belief is not random. It is built from repeated past experiences, where people who tried to leave eventually came back, where every conflict ended in reconciliation, where every time you were hurt but stayed became proof that they still held the central position. Gradually, their mind stops viewing the relationship as a connection between two individuals and instead sees it as a predictable system, one in which they are the gravitational force and you are the object orbiting around them. So when you disappear from that orbit, they do not panic immediately. They do not collapse right away. Because in their internal logic, you have not truly left. You are merely temporarily off course. This explains why, in the early days, they may seem completely normal, even indifferent. Not because they do not care, but because they have not yet recognized the real threat. They still believe the system is functioning as usual, that you will return once emotions settle, that you will miss them enough to break the silence. And this belief creates a dangerous state, false confidence, a state where they feel no urgency to act, because they believe time is on their side. What they fail to understand is that this time your silence is not part of the cycle, it is the end of the cycle. And this difference cannot be recognized immediately by a mind conditioned to control. So they begin to wait not with anxiety, but with expectation. They wait for the familiar message, the explanation, the moment you break the distance. Because in their experience, that is always how things unfold. People cannot tolerate ambiguity for long. They need closure, they need conversation, they need resolution. And they rely on this as a universal psychological rule. But what they do not anticipate is that you have stepped out of that need. You no longer require closure from them. And when that happens, time begins to function in a completely different way in their mind. In the first few days, without any signal, they still hold on to their belief. But as silence stretches into weeks, a misalignment begins to form because their predictive system no longer matches reality. This is where the fracture begins, not as a dramatic shock, but as a subtle and continuous inconsistency. Each day that passes without your return becomes a new piece of data they cannot place within their old model. And as these pieces accumulate, their mind is forced to adjust. But instead of accepting the possibility that you have truly left, they search for safer explanations for their ego. They may think you are using silence to gain attention, that you are testing them, that you are waiting for them to initiate. These interpretations allow them to delay confronting the truth, because that truth is dangerous. If you have left without needing them, then their belief in their control is false. However, no matter how they interpret it, reality does not change. You remain silent. You do not react. And this silence begins to create a kind of pressure they are not equipped to handle, because they are used to conflict, to dialogue, to having emotional data, to manipulate. But here, there is nothing, no signal, no reaction, no anchor. In that environment, their mind shifts from waiting to testing. They begin to act not with sincerity, but with strategy. A brief message, a neutral question, a subtle signal, everything is designed to provoke a response without exposing vulnerability. Because the goal is not reconnection, but confirmation that the bond still exists. If you respond, even with a single word, they will quickly interpret it as proof that the system is still active, that you remain within their sphere of influence. And from there, they can begin pulling you back into the old cycle. But if you do not respond, if you maintain your separation, then each failed attempt becomes new evidence against their old belief. At this point, denial becomes harder to sustain. Reality has accumulated enough to create a contradiction they can no longer ignore. You are not returning, you are not reacting, and you are no longer behaving in a way they can predict. And it is precisely this unpredictability that causes them to lose their sense of direction. Because their power was never in whether you stayed or left. It was in their ability to read you, predict you, and shape your behavior through emotional triggers. But when you become silent in a way that cannot be decoded, that entire toolkit becomes useless. For the first time, they are faced with a kind of reality for which they have no prepared strategy, a state they cannot control, with familiar techniques. And from this moment, a deeper shift begins to take form. From the belief that you will return to the doubt that perhaps this time you will not. And even if they have not fully accepted it, the mere existence of that possibility is enough to destabilize the psychological foundation they relied on throughout the relationship. Because if there's even one person who can leave and not come back, then their power is no longer absolute. And when a system built on the assumption of absolute control begins to encounter exceptions, that system itself can no longer remain stable. The real turning point does not lie in the fact that you left, but in the moment they begin to realize that this time there is no cycle that will automatically bring you back. Because when their initial waiting is not met, when their familiar predictions no longer align with reality, a very strange feeling begins to seep into the psychological system they once believed to be untouchable. It is not sadness, nor regret, but a kind of emptiness that is difficult to name. For the first time, they receive no signal to hold on to, no explanation to distort, no emotion to exploit, no reaction to measure. And it is precisely this complete absence that pushes them into a state they were never prepared to face. You need to understand that for a narcissist, a relationship has never been about two individuals coexisting, but about a system driven by influence, where they constantly check whether they are still producing an effect. In that system, every emotion you display has utility, even your pain, because it confirms that they still occupy a place in your inner world. But when you become silent in a way that cannot be triggered, cannot be pulled back, you unintentionally withdraw all the data they use to locate themselves. And this creates a void they cannot fill with their usual mechanisms. At this point, they begin to shift from waiting to probing. However, it is crucial to understand the nature of these actions. From the outside, they may appear as concern, as an attempt to reconnect. But internally, they serve a completely different function. They are subtle tests designed to answer a single question. Do I still exist in their mind? That is why they will not approach you with genuine vulnerability. They will not say, I miss you, or I was wrong, because doing so would require them to place themselves in a position where they could be rejected. Instead, they choose safer routes for the ego, a casual message, a seemingly harmless check-in, a memory brought up at the right moment. Everything is calculated to provoke a response without exposing dependence. Because the goal is not to repair the relationship, but to reactivate the psychological connection they have lost. And this is where the difference between who you are now and who you were before becomes decisive. In the past, you might have responded, explained, or been drawn back into the familiar loop of dialogue and emotion. But now, if you maintain your stillness, if you provide no reaction, then each failed attempt becomes a direct blow to the structure of their belief system. Because it does not just say that you no longer care, it says that they no longer have the ability to make you care. And for someone whose identity is built on influence, this is a deeper threat than any direct rejection. Remember, being rejected is still a form of interaction. It still confirms that they can generate strong emotion. But complete indifference is different. It does not just remove them from the relationship, it removes them from your emotional frame of reference. And when that happens, they do not just lose you, they lose the role they assigned to themselves in your story. This loss of role begins to create a form of internal instability. They no longer know where to place themselves in that story. They are no longer the misunderstood one, no longer the one in control, no longer the center of conflict or reconciliation. They become an external factor, a variable with no influence. And this contradicts everything they have used to define themselves for so long. So their mind begins searching for ways to restore that position. But when direct attempts fail, they are forced to move in another direction, less visible, but more defensive, rewriting the narrative. This is the stage where they begin to change how they understand you and the relationship, not because they've gained new information, but because they need a version of the story in which they do not have to face the truth that they have lost control. In that version, your silence is no longer a sign of maturity or independence. It becomes evidence of coldness, ingratitude, or instability. By assigning negative traits to you, they can preserve a positive image of themselves without having to change. And this is not a conscious decision, but an almost automatic psychological process where the ego does everything it can to protect itself from collapse. Yet no matter how the external narrative is rewritten, there remains a deeper layer within them that cannot be so easily altered, a vague but persistent awareness that something is no longer functioning as before, that there is someone they cannot pull back. This awareness, even if never directly acknowledged, continues to exist as a background disturbance in their thinking, because it raises a question they cannot comfortably answer. If you, someone who once reacted strongly, who was deeply attached, who returned many times, can become completely detached, then what does that say about others and about themselves? And this unspoken question begins to erode the core belief they have relied on, that their influence is stable, that their position in others' minds is secure, that every relationship can ultimately be brought back into a state they control. Because once a clear enough exception appears, the entire belief system can no longer remain intact in its original form. From here, a new phase begins to take shape, no longer simple waiting or testing, but an increasingly clear confrontation with the possibility that this time you have truly stepped beyond the reach of their control. The true breaking point does not lie in what you do, but in what you no longer do. Because when all their probing attempts bring no response, when the signals they send fall into a void without creating any ripple within you, a truth begins to take shape in their awareness, whether they want to admit it or not. Their influence is gone. Not diminished, not temporarily weakened, but gone in a way they cannot trace. And this creates a form of deep loss of control they have never experienced before. Understand this, for a narcissist, whether you stay or leave has never been the core issue. The core issue is whether you still react, because your reaction is the proof of their existence in your psychological world. And when that proof disappears, they do not just lose a relationship, they lose a part of their self-validation mechanism, a reflective system they relied on to maintain their self-image. That is why what unsettles them is not your absence, but the absence of impact. They can no longer provoke emotion, no longer trigger reactions, no longer regulate your psychological rhythm. And this creates a void they cannot fill with their usual strategies. In this state, their mind does not shift into sadness in the conventional sense, because sadness requires acknowledging loss, and that acknowledgement directly threatens the ego. Instead, a different response emerges, colder, quieter, but more persistent. Instability transforming into a need to regain control. And when direct control is no longer possible, they shift toward indirect control. They stop trying to pull you back through interaction and begin trying to reshape how you are perceived. Because if they cannot control you, they can still attempt to control the narrative about you. This is where many people misunderstand. They assume that when a narcissist starts speaking negatively, distorting facts, or reframing the relationship, it is simply an expression of anger. But at a deeper level, it is a structural defense mechanism, an attempt to restore internal stability by rewriting reality in a way that protects the ego. Because the truth that you left calmly, without resentment, without seeking revenge, is one of the most dangerous scenarios for them. It gives them no leverage to counterattack, no data to prove that you are the problem. And so they are forced to create that data. They begin to reinterpret the past, selectively recalling memories, amplifying details that favor them while discarding those that do not. Not because they are deliberately lying in the conventional sense, but because they need a version of the story in which they do not have to face the possibility that you left because you saw the truth. In this new version, you are no longer the one who tried, who endured, who was patient. You become the one who is confusing, who changed, who is ungrateful or unstable. Because only by placing you in that role can they maintain their own position as reasonable within the narrative. And this allows them to preserve a sense of control, at least on a cognitive level. Yet there is a paradox they cannot fully escape. While the external story can be adjusted, the internal experience cannot be completely erased. At some level, they still know that something has changed irreversibly, that there is someone who has stepped out of their orbit without leaving any emotional trace to follow. And this vague awareness creates a persistent tension. It is not clear enough to be directly confronted, yet not weak enough to be ignored. From here, a deeper process begins, one where internal instability seeks balance by reinforcing ego-protective beliefs. They may become more convinced that you are the problem, tell the story with greater conviction not only to others, but to themselves. Because each repetition reduces the pressure of the unacknowledged truth. But what must be seen is that all of this does not come from strength, it comes from fragility. Not from transcendence, but from avoidance. Because if they were truly stable, they would not need to reconstruct the narrative so aggressively. They would be able to reflect, analyze, and accept their share of responsibility. But their inability to do so forces them to maintain an alternative explanatory system in which you become the variable that must be adjusted for the system to keep functioning. And throughout this entire process, there is one thing they cannot change: the reality that you no longer participate, you no longer provide feedback, you are no longer part of a system they can manipulate. And no matter how they reinterpret it, this remains an unalterable point, a piece of evidence that their power has limits, that some people can leave without being pulled back. And it is precisely the existence of that limit that they find most difficult to accept. Because it does not apply only to you, it introduces the possibility that it could apply to anyone. And when a system built on the assumption of absolute control begins to face the possibility of limits, its entire structure can no longer remain stable. From that point forward, whatever reactions they display externally, all carry the imprint of one underlying truth. They no longer control how the story ends. The moment everything becomes most clear is not when they try to pull you back, but when they begin to realize that no matter what they do, you no longer respond the way you used to. That moment creates a powerful collision between reality and the ego they have constructed over time. For the first time, they cannot explain you through familiar patterns. They cannot place you back into your old role. They cannot reactivate the responses that once allowed them to maintain control. And this forces them to confront a question they have always avoided. If you no longer react, then what are they in your world? Because for a narcissist, self-worth is not built from within. It is continuously confirmed through how others respond to them. Every time you were hurt, every time you tried to explain, every time you returned after being wounded, it all served as confirmation that they still mattered, still had influence, still existed as a force within your mind. But when you no longer provide those reactions, they do not just lose a relationship, they lose a reflective mechanism that made them feel real. And this creates a form of insecurity far deeper than ordinary rejection. Because rejection is still interaction, it still confirms that they can evoke strong emotion. Indifference, however, is different. It does not just say that you no longer need them, it says that they no longer have the ability to create need within you. And so they enter a more complex psychological state. They are no longer simply trying to control you, they begin trying to re-evaluate reality. They revisit what happened, not to understand, but to find a point that can be interpreted in their favor. And when they cannot find one, they begin to create it. They may recall minor details and exaggerate them, reinterpret conversations in ways that place you at fault. Because if they do not, they would have to face a dangerous possibility that you did not leave out of weakness, not out of impulsive emotion, but because you saw something real. Yet alongside this narrative reconstruction, another stream of thought persists, one they cannot fully control: curiosity. A recurring question forms in their mind: what changed in you? How could someone who once reacted intensely, who was deeply attached, who returned many times, become so silent and unreachable? And it is this question that prevents them from fully letting go, because it is not only about you, it is about them. It suggests that something in the way they operate may no longer be effective, that the system they believe to be stable may have a flaw. And once that idea appears, even briefly, it begins to undermine the certainty they rely on. From here, a paradox forms. Externally, they may appear indifferent. They may say you are unimportant, replaceable, that they have moved on. But internally, you become a case they cannot fully explain. Because most people in their life follow the familiar pattern. They are drawn in, pulled away, and then return. But you did not. You broke the cycle. And by breaking it, you cease to be a predictable part of their system. You become an exception. And people, in general, feel deeply unsettled by exceptions they cannot explain. So even when they try to push you out of their thoughts, you return in their mind as an unanswered question. This is why, after some time, they may reappear, not because they truly want to reconnect, but because they want to test whether that exception still exists. They want to know whether you remain in that detached state, whether they can still trigger the old reactions. And each time they try and fail, each time they encounter the same calm silence, that question becomes reinforced. That there is someone they cannot pull back. And this, whether they admit it or not, begins to shape how they see themselves, because it establishes a clear limit to a power they once believed had none. And at this point, a truth becomes increasingly difficult to deny, not immediately, not explicitly, but enough to create constant pressure. You did not leave because you were weak. You left because you understood. And if that is true, then everything they believed about the relationship, the way they defined themselves, and the way they believed they could control other people, would all need to be reconsidered. And for an ego not built for self-reflection, that is an almost impossible task. So they may continue to avoid, continue to rewrite the story, continue trying to reaffirm their image elsewhere, but deep inside, your existence as an exception remains there, like a point that does not fit, something they cannot fully eliminate, proof that there are limits they cannot surpass, and that this time the story ended in a way they were not the one to decide. The point at which everything begins to move into a deeper layer is not when they are still trying to control you, but when they gradually realize that there is no longer any way to pull you back into your old state, not because you are stronger than they are, but because you have stopped participating in the mechanism they have always relied on to operate every relationship. And it is precisely that withdrawal of participation that they cannot handle. Because over a long period of time, they did not learn how to build real connection. They only learned how to maintain influence. They did not learn how to face an independent human being. They only became accustomed to adjusting other people's reactions in order to keep themselves at the center. So when you become silent in a way that can no longer be triggered, can no longer be drawn into conflict, can no longer be guided by the emotions they create, You do not simply leave them, you leave the entire system they use to define reality. And that creates a kind of crisis they cannot name, because it does not resemble any experience they have had before. It is not ordinary loss, not a breakup, but the collapse of a foundational assumption that they can always affect other people if they want to. In this state, they begin to feel something they have always avoided: helplessness. Not helplessness in action, but helplessness in influence. They may still speak, still appear, still try to approach you, but they no longer produce the corresponding reaction. And it is precisely this mismatch that causes them to lose their sense of direction, because their entire cognitive system is based on the relationship between action and reaction. They do something and expect a certain result, but now that result no longer comes. And when a system can no longer predict outcomes, it no longer feels safe. And when it no longer feels safe, it begins trying to protect itself, not by changing itself, but by changing the way it interprets reality. This is when they shift from trying to control you to trying to control the way the story is told. Because if they cannot bring you back, they can still try to bring your image back into a position they can tolerate. They begin speaking about you in ways that make your departure seem reasonable within their framework, not because they want to hurt you, but because they need to protect themselves from a truth that is too difficult to accept, that someone saw their entire structure and chose not to participate anymore. But alongside that process, something else is happening deeper within them, something they cannot fully control. It is the collision between the ego and a disowned part of themselves, a part they have spent their entire life avoiding, the part that recognizes that what they relied on was never as solid as they thought, that their control is not absolute, that there are limits they cannot overcome through strategy or manipulation alone. And this collision is not experienced as an opportunity for self-understanding, but as an attack. Because for them, anything that threatens the ego must be resisted, not explored. So instead of looking inward, they push all that discomfort outward. They assign it to you. They see you as the cause of the instability they are feeling. Because if they can believe that you are the problem, then they do not have to face the part within themselves that has been activated. And this is when their emotion begins to shift from instability into a kind of silent hatred, not an explosive anger you can clearly see, but a cold, steady, enduring current of feeling, fueled by the need to protect the ego from collapse. What is important to understand is that this hatred is not truly directed at you as a person. It is directed at the meaning you represent. You become the symbol of a truth they cannot accept, that they are not all powerful, that they do not control everyone, that there are people who can see through what they present and still choose to leave. And that is why your existence, even when you are no longer there, continues to trigger something inside them, because you are not just someone who left, you are proof that their system can be broken. And when someone cannot destroy that proof by pulling you back, they will try to destroy its meaning by changing the way they perceive you. They may call you weak, unstable, or wrong, because if they can believe that strongly enough, then the evidence you represent loses its weight, and they can continue maintaining their self-image without having to change. Yet no matter how hard they try, there remains a part of them that knows the story does not fully fit. And it is precisely this lack of fit that creates a kind of ongoing tension. It is not large enough to force change, but neither is it small enough to be ignored. And that leaves them trapped in a repetitive state, where they continue reinforcing the external story while an unresolved contradiction still exists within. From your point of view, what matters is not what they think or what they say, but that you have stepped out of a system that once pulled you in. You have stopped feeding energy into a mechanism you once did not even realize was operating. And it is precisely your ability to maintain that state, not returning, not reacting, not trying to fix what was never yours to fix, that causes the entire old structure to stop functioning. Because a system only exists as long as all of its parts continue to participate. And when one essential part fully withdraws, that system can no longer operate in the same way. And that is what is happening. It is not that you are fighting them. You have simply stopped sustaining a reality they needed in order to feel stable. And in the emptiness you leave behind, they are forced to face themselves in a way they were never prepared for. What is truly dangerous is not that they lose you, but the moment they begin to feel that they have lost something far more important, the ability to shape your reality. Because throughout the relationship, they did not only influence your emotions, they gradually shaped the way you saw yourself, the way you understood right and wrong, the way you reacted to hurt. And when you step out of that entire system, you do not simply disappear from their life, you shatter the mold they had unconsciously placed upon you. And this creates a kind of reaction that may appear very calm on the outside, but inside is profoundly chaotic. Because for the first time, they can no longer read you. They do not know what you are thinking, do not know what you still feel, do not know whether you have completely left or are merely waiting for something. And it is precisely this unpredictability that causes them to lose their bearings, because their power never lay in whether you stayed or left. It lay in the fact that they always knew how to make you react, always knew how to pull you back into an emotional state they could control. But now you no longer react in any of the ways they are familiar with. You no longer argue, no longer explain, no longer seek clarity from them. And this leaves them with no foothold to continue operating their old strategies. In that state, a silent tension begins to build. Because they cannot return to direct control, but neither can they completely ignore the change you have created. And it is precisely this tension that causes them to shift into another kind of awareness, where they are no longer simply trying to control you, but begin to feel threatened by your very existence, not because you are doing something against them, but because you represent something they cannot accept, that there are people who do not need them in order to feel whole. That runs directly against the psychological structure they have built, in which their value is confirmed through others needing them, reacting to them, being influenced by them. And when someone who once existed deeply within that system can step out of it and no longer need them, that entire foundation begins to shake, because it introduces a dangerous possibility that their control was never absolute, that what they believed was certain only existed under the condition that you continued participating. And when you no longer participate, they are forced to face a void they do not know how to fill, not the void of your absence, but their own void, a part inside themselves they once always covered with reflection from others. And now, without that reflection, they begin to see things they do not want to see, not clearly or consciously, but as a persistent discomfort, an unease with no obvious cause. And in order to escape that feeling, they do not turn inward to understand it, they turn outward to find something to carry it, and that something becomes you. From there, the discomfort transforms into a colder, sharper, more defensive emotion: hatred. But what matters is this: that hatred does not come from you hurting them in the ordinary sense. It comes from the fact that you destabilize the image they need in order to feel stable. You become proof that they do not control everything, that there are limits they cannot overcome. And for an ego built on the illusion of control, nothing is more threatening than being forced to face limitation. So instead of accepting that, they begin constructing a new layer of explanation in which you are no longer the person who saw the truth and chose to leave, but the one who was wrong, the one who betrayed, the one who failed to understand them. Because only by placing you in that position can they preserve their image of themselves without having to change. And this process unfolds not only in what they tell others, but also in what they tell themselves. Because if they do not believe that story, they would have to face a far more difficult truth. Yet no matter how much they try to reconstruct the story, one thing can never be fully erased: their direct experience of losing influence over you. A memory that needs no explanation, no interpretation, simply a reality that happened. And it is precisely this reality that continues to exist as a contradiction inside their cognitive system, because it does not fit with what they believe about themselves. And when a belief system has to contain such a contradiction, it can no longer remain as stable as it once was. This explains why, even as they try to move on, build new relationships, and create new stories, There are still moments when their thoughts return to you, not because they miss you in an emotional sense, but because you represent an unanswered question, an unexplained exception. And each time that question arises, it reminds them of something they do not want to admit, that there was someone who once lived inside their world, understood how it worked, and still chose to leave without coming back. And it is the very existence of that possibility that prevents them from ever being completely at peace. Because it does not only concern you, it opens the possibility that anyone could do the same. And when a person begins to realize that their power has limits, whether they accept it or not, part of the old structure has already begun to crack. And from your point of view, what matters is not how they respond to that crack, but that you have stepped out of a role that no longer belongs to you. You have stopped reacting in the way you were once conditioned to react. And that change, even though it is not loud, not dramatic, is what creates the deepest impact of all, not by fighting them, but by no longer needing them to define who you are. The point at which everything becomes irreversible is not when you leave, but when you begin to see them more clearly than they ever allowed you to, because what truly unsettles a narcissist is not losing a person, but being seen through by the very person they once believed they could fully control. And when that happens, you are no longer a part of their story. You become a threat to the entire story they have built about themselves. Understand this in practical terms. They do not exist on the basis of truth. They exist on the basis of how they are perceived. They construct an image that may be attractive, pitiable, or admirable, but it is always controlled, always arranged to conceal the parts they do not want to face. And for a long time, you saw them through that lens as well. You believed the story they told, you interpreted their behavior in ways that benefited them, you even adjusted yourself in order to keep that story from falling apart. But then there comes a point, usually after many repetitions, many contradictions that cannot be explained, many distortions you can no longer ignore, when you begin to see the pattern instead of separate events. You realize that what you thought was random was actually repeated, that what you thought was misunderstanding was actually strategy, that what you thought was your fault was actually a system designed to make you think that way. And that moment of realization is the moment you step out of their story, not through action, but through awareness. And when awareness changes, your role changes with it. You are no longer the one who needs to explain, no longer the one who needs to be understood, no longer the one trying to keep the relationship functioning. You become the observer. And for a narcissist, nothing is more dangerous than a conscious observer, because they cannot manipulate someone who no longer participates. They cannot control someone who no longer believes the story, and they cannot maintain their image when someone can see what lies behind it. From there, a very characteristic reaction begins to form, not immediately, not in an obvious way, but strongly enough to shape how they treat you afterward. It is a process of projection in which everything they cannot accept about themselves is assigned to you. If they were manipulative, you will be called manipulative. If they were dishonest, you will be seen as untrustworthy. If they lacked empathy, you will be labeled cold. And this is not random. It is the way they move the parts they cannot face out of themselves in order to protect the ego structure. And you, the one who saw them most clearly, become the most convenient place to deposit those parts. What makes this process even more powerful is the distance you create. Because when you are no longer there to respond, to correct, to provide context, the story they build meets no direct resistance. They can retell it however they want, rearrange events, emphasize favorable details, and ignore unfavorable ones. And over time, that story is not only told to others, it is repeated often enough to become the way they believe reality itself. And this is when, from the outside, everything may look very convincing, because they are not merely telling a story, they are believing it. But what matters is that no matter how carefully that story is constructed, there remains a deeper layer they cannot fully control. The awareness that you saw something they did not want to be seen, that you understood how they operate, and that you left not because you were weak, but because you were no longer influenced by what they created. And this awareness is the source of the quiet hatred they may feel, because you are not just someone who left you, are someone carrying a truth they cannot erase. From here, a paradox begins to emerge in the way they see you. On the surface, they may regard you as unimportant, easily replaced, a mistake they have already moved beyond. But inwardly, you become a point they cannot fully explain, a memory that does not fit the model they believe in. And it is precisely this lack of fit that makes you harder to forget than others, not because you are special in the ordinary sense, but because you are an exception. And people, especially those who depend on structures of control, are always haunted by exceptions they cannot fit into the system. So even when they try to diminish you in words, to reduce your value in the story, there remains a part of them returning to the same question. How could someone they once believed they fully understood change in a way they could no longer predict? And that question opens a possibility they do not want to face. That if you could see and leave, others might be able to do the same. And if that happens, then the entire system they rely on to feel stable will no longer function as before. That is why, when they cannot pull you back, they do not stop at ignoring you, they try to destroy your image. Not because you deserve it, but because it is the only way they know to reduce the threat you represent. Because if they can believe that you are the problem, then they do not have to face the possibility that the problem lies within the very structure they have built for themselves. And throughout this entire process, one thing does not change: the fact that you have stepped out of the role they assigned to you. You are no longer the mirror reflecting them. You are no longer the source of data they use to maintain their image. And that absence, though not loud or direct, continues to shake the foundation they always believed was solid. Because you did not just leave, you carried with you the ability to see the truth. And that is something they cannot control, cannot erase, and cannot fully forget. The point at which everything becomes prolonged and hardest to end is not when the relationship stops, but when time begins to pass, and instead of softening everything, it quietly amplifies what remains unresolved inside them. Because contrary to what many people think, a narcissist does not let go in the normal way. They do not look back in order to understand, do not face things in order to grow. They repeat in order to protect. They do not reflect, they reenact. And it is precisely this difference that causes your image in their mind not to fade, but to become distorted over time. Look at how an emotionally mature person processes the past. They may remember, ask questions, recognize mistakes on both sides, and gradually integrate the experience into their understanding as a lesson. But with a psychological structure dependent on protecting the ego, that process almost never happens. Instead, a different loop takes over, one in which they return to old memories not to understand them, but to reinterpret them in ways that benefit themselves. And each time they reinterpret them, the story becomes harder, more extreme, and further from reality. What was once a small disagreement may be exaggerated into proof that you were always wrong. Moments when you set boundaries may be turned into coldness. And your decision to leave, which came from clarity, is reconstructed into betrayal. And this does not happen once, it happens again and again. Each recollection becomes another slight revision until the final version no longer resembles what actually happened. From the outside, this may look irrational, but from the inside, it is the only way they know to keep their belief system from collapsing. Because if they stop and look honestly at reality, they would have to face a massive contradiction. On one side, the belief that they are valuable, in control, and compelling. On the other, the truth that there was someone who knew them deeply and still chose to leave. And those two things cannot coexist without generating pressure. So instead of resolving the contradiction, they choose to strengthen one side. They make the story about you more negative in order to make your leaving make sense within their system. And the more they do that, the more right they feel, because every repetition strengthens the emotion attached to the story. And at a certain point, they may truly believe it is the truth. But there is one thing this process can never fully erase: the initial feeling they had when they realized you no longer reacted a very specific moment when their system stopped working. And no matter how much they try to cover it with the new story, that memory remains as a piece of data that does not fit. something that cannot easily be integrated into the version of reality they are trying to maintain. That is why, beneath all the explanations, beneath all the stories told and retold, there still exists another line of thought, quieter but more persistent: curiosity. Not curiosity about you in an emotional sense, but curiosity about the change they do not understand. How could someone who once reacted strongly become so silent and unreachable? How could someone who was once attached become so independent that they no longer needed any validation at all? And this question has no easy answer within their system, because to answer it, they would have to admit that the change was not random, but came from the fact that you saw something real. Over time, this curiosity does not disappear. It only changes form. Sometimes it appears as a passing thought when they see something that reminds them of you. Sometimes it appears as a small action looking for information about you, asking others about you, or observing from a distance. These actions are not always fully conscious, but they all serve the same purpose: to check whether that exception still exists, to see whether you have truly changed or whether it is only temporary. And every time they do not find any sign that you are returning, every time they face the image of you no longer connected to them, that question is reinforced once again. This creates a very particular state in which outwardly they may continue with life, build new relationships, and present themselves as having moved on. Yet inwardly, you still exist as an unresolved variable, a point that does not fit within the system. And people in general do not easily tolerate such points of misalignment, especially when their entire sense of stability depends on everything being predictable. So instead of letting it remain as an open question, they keep returning to revise the story, making it tighter, clearer, more extreme, hoping that if the story becomes strong enough, it can overpower the contradiction underneath. But what they do not realize is that the very fact that they must constantly reinforce that story is evidence that it is not entirely solid, because a truth does not need to be repeated that many times in order to exist. And throughout this entire process, there is something you may not see from the outside: the quiet exhaustion of a system that is always having to defend itself, always having to reconstruct itself, always having to avoid. Because every time they return to the story, every time they try to explain the past again, they are postponing facing one simple but deeply difficult truth: that there was someone who saw them clearly and still chose not to stay. And that does not concern only you. It raises a larger question about themselves, a question they may avoid for a time but cannot completely erase. And over time, the existence of that question becomes a kind of background pressure, a constant reminder that there is another reality beyond the story they are telling, a reality they do not control. And in that reality, you are no longer part of the old system, no longer the source of reflection, no longer someone who needs them in order to define your worth. And this, though not loud or direct, is what has the longest lasting impact, because it does not depend on what they think or say. It exists independently of their story, as proof that there are some things that cannot be restructured simply by telling them in a different way. The true ending of this entire story does not lie in whether they eventually understand anything, but in the moment when you no longer need them to understand. Because throughout the journey, you unconsciously believed that if you explained clearly enough, patiently enough, sincerely enough, they would see the truth, recognize what happened, change, or at least admit it. But what you gradually realize is not merely that they cannot understand in the ordinary sense, it is that they are not built to face that kind of understanding. Because to truly understand, they would have to look into the inner parts they have spent a lifetime avoiding. And that requires a level of internal honesty their structure does not support. So instead of waiting for an understanding that never comes, you begin to turn in another direction, not outward, but inward. You stop asking, why are they like this? And begin asking, why did I stay so long? And that shift is the most important turning point, because it moves you out of the role of reaction and places you in the position of observation, where you are no longer swept up by each individual behavior, but can see the entire pattern, how everything repeats, how you are pulled in, how you begin doubting yourself. And once you see the pattern, You no longer need more evidence in order to leave. From there, what happens is not a sudden transformation, but a quiet internal restructuring in which you begin reclaiming the parts of yourself you once gave away, not because you were weak, but because you had not yet realized you were doing it. You reclaim the right to define your own emotions. You reclaim the right to decide what is right for you. You reclaim the right to exist without needing validation from someone who is incapable of giving it in a healthy way. And in that process, you begin to understand something deeply important, that your leaving is not an act against them, but an act of returning to yourself. You do not leave to punish them. You do not leave to prove anything. You leave because you can no longer continue to exist within a system that requires you to shrink yourself in order for it to function. And when you stand in that place, another profound shift occurs. You no longer see their reaction as a measure of your worth. You are no longer affected by the way they tell the story, because you understand that the story was never built to reflect truth, but to protect them from truth. And once you understand that, whatever they say about you, whether positive or negative, loses the weight it once had. This does not mean you feel nothing. It does not mean you become numb. It means that you no longer place your value in the hands of someone who has no ability to hold it safely. From there, a kind of freedom begins to form, not freedom from them in the physical sense, but freedom from the need to be understood by them, to be recognized by them, to be treated by them in the way you once hoped for. And it is precisely this freedom that changes the entire way you exist. Because when you are no longer bound by those needs, you are no longer easily pulled back, no longer easily triggered by familiar behaviors, no longer easily drawn into loops you once did not even recognize. And what is striking is that from their perspective, this change is not understood as growth, but as a threat, because it strips them of their ability to influence you. It shows them that what they once relied on to control you no longer works. And this forces them to choose between two paths: either face the truth and change, or reinforce the story in order to continue avoiding it. And as you have seen, most will choose the second path, not because it is better, but because it is easier. But what matters is that their choice no longer determines your direction, because you have stepped out of the position they could shape. You are no longer part of the system they operate. You have become an independent being with your own frame of reference, where your worth is not measured by how much you are needed, but by how honest you are with yourself. And this is where the whole meaning of the story changes. It is no longer a story about what they do, what they think, or how they react. It becomes a story about what you saw, what you understood, and what you chose after understanding. Because in the end, the most important thing is not that a narcissist cannot forget you, but that you no longer need to be remembered by them in order to feel valuable. And when you reach that point, you do not simply leave a relationship, you leave an old way of existing, one that depended on validation from outside yourself, and step into a new way of being, in which you define yourself not through the reactions of others, but through your own awareness of what you deserve. After everything, the most important thing to remember is not how the narcissist reacted, what they said about you, or how they tried to distort the story, but a very simple truth with enormous weight. You saw clearly, and you did not go back. In a world where emotions are often exploited, where silence is often mistaken for weakness, you did the opposite. You chose not to react, not to explain, not to prove anything, and that very choice shattered the entire system they once relied on to exist. Because for someone who lives through control, nothing is more frightening than a person who no longer needs them in order to feel whole, no longer revolves around them to define their worth, no longer reacts in a way they can cling to as proof that they still have power. You did not need to defeat them, did not need to make them realize their mistakes, did not need to make them change, because the truth is that the moment you left in full awareness, you did the very thing they could not accept most. You ended the role they assigned to you without needing their permission. And that is what makes you unforgettable, not because they loved you, but because you are living proof that they are not all-powerful, that their influence has limits, that there are people who can step out of the loop they once believed no one could escape. But more important than anything they may think about you afterward is who you became after you left. You are no longer the person seeking validation from a place that could never give it in a healthy way. You are no longer the person trying to preserve a relationship by sacrificing yourself. You became someone who understands that self-worth does not come from being kept, but from knowing when it is time to leave. And within that transformation, there is a kind of freedom no one can take back from you, because it does not depend on circumstances, does not depend on other people. It comes from the clarity within you. When you are no longer pulled into the old loops, no longer triggered by familiar behaviors, no longer feel the need to prove anything to someone who does not want to understand, you begin to live differently, a way that is not loud, but steady, where you do not need to defeat anyone in order to know you are right, do not need anyone's validation in order to know you are enough. And that is where the story truly ends, not on their side, but on yours, where you are no longer defined by what happened, but by the way you chose to walk away from it. Because in the end, the one who leaves is not the one who loses, but the one who dares to face the truth and refuses to keep living inside an illusion. And in a world where so many people are still trapped in invisible cycles, that is not just a choice, it is an awakening.